Good evening. Thank you all for coming. Some will join us along the way. And we have, we opened the door to a discussion in the last few sessions. We opened the discussion about the environmental issues through the lens of Jewish thought. And we had an introduction session with me, and then we had 4 sessions with Jeremy Benstein, which was like a kind of also introduction to the main approaches towards the issue in Judaism. And now we have the honor, and more than an honor, we have the pleasure to have Daniel Voskoboynik with us. And Daniel is a friend. And Daniel, I think if we are interested in this issue intellectually and culturally, I think Daniel in many ways lives the issue. No? Also academically as a PhD student of ecology and Judaism, but also in touch with the activist world around it. So it's also opportunity to look at the issue through this point of view. And hopefully this process of study will lead us also to kind of action, to kind of active involvement. So thank you very much, Daniel, for being with us. And Daniel is also a very potent storyteller. So I think it will be interesting to listen to you. We are very happy that you are here and for the opportunity to study with you. So we are in your hands, Daniel.
Thank you so much, Zev, and everyone there. I'm so sorry I can't be with you in person, but through the miracle of this technology, we can be a little bit connected. And it's a huge honor for me to be able to study with you. I'll be speaking for a little over an hour, hopefully telling stories, sharing a few things, bringing my cart of seeds and ideas to the shadow market and see which ones resonate, which ones you want to pick up and put down. I will warn you that sometimes my style, it's a little bit like my grandmother's cooking. There will be a lot. It might be a bit overwhelming, hard to digest, but hopefully there'll be some nourishment by the end. And if you're confused at any point, this is good. There's a productive and healthy confusion. There'll be a lot of time at the end for questions. But if I'm speaking too fast or there's something very urgent, please interrupt me. There's the Jewish learning space, so interruptions, disagreements are not just welcome, but part of this. Okay? But my subject today is called An Open Past Unlocks the Future Towards Jewish Diasporic Ecologies. I won't explain the title now. My hope is that by the end of today, the title makes a bit more sense. And I would like to invite with the image, we have the golden epave in Yiddish, the golden peacock. For those of you familiar with Yiddish folklore, the golden peacock is a mythical creature from Jewish folklore, which is said to appear when in the presence of Yiddish song and storytelling. So I hope that during the course of today, we might even be blessed by the appearance of this being, which can give us wisdom and courage to face the ecological crisis we're in. But before we begin with ideas and with activating the mind, I'd like to invite us just to have a brief moment of meditation. 1 second, my computer froze, so I need to go to the next slide. Oops. 1 second. Can you see the screen or not yet?
Yeah.
Okay. So I would just invite you, feel free to close your eyes if you can, to find your comfort in your seat where you are. And I want you to just focus consciously on your breathing, your inhalation, your respiration. Try and take a few deep breaths to arrive to the conversation that we're going to have today. Remember that inhaling is the first thing that we do when we come into the world, and exhaling is the last thing that we do when we leave the material realm. But come back to your body, to the most important ecology that you know, the most intimate ecology you know, the ecosystem that you carry with you. How does it feel? Is there any parts that feel a little bit heavy or more light? How is your body with us today? And taking deep breaths and offering gratitude to all the different organisms and organs that comprise you, offering gratitude to your life. I invite you to think to a teacher of yours who is responsible for you being here today, a teacher of environmental issues or ecology. It can be a human being, could be a family member. A teacher could also be a plant or an animal or a river. I'd like for you to think about who is one of your closest ecological teachers. And I would like to dedicate our learning today to them. So as you dedicate your learning as well to those teachers of yours, whenever you feel comfortable, come back into the space. Wonderful. Okay, thank you, everyone. I hope that you're feeling your breath a little bit more wider. And in the spirit of expansion, I leave you here with an image. This is the traditional ornamental decoration of especially Ashkenazi Eastern European shawls from the early 18th century. And it gives us a bit of a sense of what I want to try and do today, which is to kind of expand, to color, to reforest our imagination about what Jewish diasporic ecological thinking has been, is, and could be. And before we move in, I don't really love definitions. I prefer kind of orientations, but I want to talk a little bit about how I understand ecology. To me, ecology, it's a study of the opposite of separation, of connection. It involves appreciating and caring for all the complex relations between beings that sustain our lives. I mean, to be a human being in the first place is to contain a body where the majority of the cells in the human body can be considered non-human cells. They're the microorganisms in our gut and digestive system that break down the food that we eat, for example. So to be alive is to be a collaboration in the most basic way. And ecology is just an attempt to notice these collaborations and connections. And I think this rhymes with some of the beautiful reflections in the Zohar Kadosh that the healing, the rectification, the redemption of the world might emerge when we're able to better appreciate the relations and unity of things. So hopefully that's what we're going to be doing today. And I want to make sure that when we're thinking about the ecological, we are always thinking about the social. They're completely intertwined. When we think about society, it's a patchwork of relationships. Human beings cannot grow up, cannot be reared as children without reproductive work, without relationships. And so when we think about the ecological, we're always thinking about the social. I know that many of us are deeply concerned about the ecological crisis we're in, but that concern isn't just simply an ecological concern. We know that the intensity of the climate crisis emerges because of the encounter of new atmospheric conditions and social conditions. When a hurricane hits a highly wealthy community with very solid infrastructure, a same hurricane of the same degree of intensity in the weather, when it meets a community that has been stripped of protection and resources, has very different consequences. So when we're thinking about the ecological, the social always is there and always needs to be there. Okay? So these are just two places that I depart from. And what I want to be doing today is talking a lot about imagination. And imagination to me is the sibling of memory. The more expansive our memory is, the more that we can imagine. They work together. And so through some of these quotes that I like to put just as provocations, what we're going to be trying to do today is expand what we imagine was the case when we think about Jewish ecological thinking and organizing, and what is the case and what could be the case. If I leave you with anything, hopefully it's a slight expansion in your imagination. So that's the goal of today. I want to situate us before we move on, though, into what the context is that we're talking in now. As many of you know, this course is called Judaism and the Anthropocene. We are facing a pretty horrific situation when it comes to what many call a civilizational crisis, a crisis where the dominant civilization on this planet is wrecking the conditions required for the sustained, dignified survival of human species and many other species. Over the last year, especially in the global processes responsible for taking action on climate change, we have seen a major impasse, if not a huge opposite of progress, when it comes to states working together to collaborate on bolder action on climate change. And when we consider the social, we're also facing a huge range of other crises relating to genocidal violence, to displacement, to the militarization of borders, to an acceleration of loss and damage of territories, of species, of languages, of cultures all around the world. All these crises come together. And to think ecologically is to understand these crises as deeply interconnected. So we are living in urgent times, times that require deep thought and deep action. And hopefully our learning today can be of service to attending this crisis. But my wager, my hope, is that I do think that Jewish knowledge, Jewish ideas, Jewish ecological understandings offer us something. It's not a silver bullet. It's not the only thing we need to listen to and learn from. But there is much in the tradition, a huge array of riches and ideas that allow us to access different things. We have thousands of years of survival, of memory, of cultural practices from the Jewish diaspora in so many different locations and territories. So many examples of collaborations with all kinds of communities across Jewish history. There is no way to understand the broader histories of many parts of the world without understanding the Jewish story, whether it's in Europe, in Africa, in the Americas, in Asia. What we are left with is an archive of abundant ecological knowledge. I do not attempt to cover this archive in its entirety today. It's an impossible task for anyone. I also speak coming from an Ashkenazi family from mainly Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. And so my knowledge is biased by what I've been raised with, the languages that I speak, what I pay attention to. So I will only be speaking about a few things, primarily coming from Eastern Ashkenazi stories and the migration of those stories to the Americas. That's my focus today. But my hope is that some of the techniques that I talk about are applicable across the wider array of the Jewish story. Okay? So firstly, just a little bit about me, who I am, where I'm speaking from. I only bring a very small perspective to the table. It's not one that covers many things, but I think it's important to situate why I'm speaking about this and where I'm speaking from. Over the last 15 years to 20 years, I've been working in different elements of the environmental justice, the ecological justice movement. I've worked as an organizer, an educator, a translator, a journalist, finding my way. I really don't know what I've been doing, but my attempt has been to contribute with the few skills I have to trying to strengthen our movements, demanding change, enacting solutions, being in solidarity with the people most impacted by the ecological crisis. So that's been a major, major part of my trajectory. And another one, also to me, what's very important is education. I really became radicalized seeing the absence of an ecological education in my own educational upbringing, but also seeing the poverty of resources, of tools, of ideas, of inspirations that were being offered, not just to my generation, but to generations to come. So what I try and do in my work is really think through how can we find ideas, skills, resources that can encourage mobilization and create a more reparative ecological pedagogy. I'm part of a collective trying to do this too, called Post-Extractive Futures. I can talk about it more, but this is a little bit about where I come from. And I've also worked as a musician and an educator in Jewish spaces on Jewish memory work. And for many years, these two lives were kind of parallel. I struggled to understand how they fit together, how they spoke to each other. And that's currently the focus of my work. It's combining Jewish memory work with attempts to address the ecological crisis, thinking how the two can speak together. And how might we try and combine this? I think enormous wisdom can be found in listening to some of the most incredible ecological practitioners on the planet, to be found in many indigenous and land-based communities around the world. And I love this quote from the indigenous Krenak philosopher Ailton Krenak, which is that the future is ancestral and humanity needs to learn with it to step softly on the earth. Too often when we think about the ecological crisis, we are stuck within a technological paradigm, a linear paradigm of time, which says that what we need to do is progress, that we need new solutions, technological solutions, that the future is where the answers can be found. Now, this isn't wholly wrong. There are obviously technological innovations that are required, but the ecological crisis feels even more devastating if we feel that we have no answers, if that humanity simply is almost a plague on this earth and it is in our nature to be destructive. Well, in fact, many human communities have been nourishing and enriching their environments over generations. We have known how to live on this planet in a way that is soft, in a way that is ecological and nourishing. In many cases, our task is to remember. And so this is something that Krenak and many indigenous movements are pushing for, is a vision of ancestral futurism, thinking through the challenges of the present and the future, but with an eye towards the wisdom of our ancestors. And I think that this is something that the traditions of Jewish memory and remembrance can really help us with. There is wisdom, there is teaching to be found in previous generations, and there are the challenges of current generations to apply that wisdom towards. And that is hopefully something that we'll be trying to do today. So let's start moving forward. I want to also anchor myself in who are my teachers? Who am I trying to channel in what I'm sharing today? And I want to share my grandparents. The first teachers that I had when it came to ecology were my beloved grandparents, Dora and Shmil. In many ways, I kind of was frustrated with them. They were not the learned Jews that I was spoken about in the Jewish educational system and textbooks, but they were shtetl Jews. I was blessed to be raised by one of the last generations of shtetl Jews from Eastern Europe who had an incredible knowledge of forestry, of agriculture, of trees, of species, of architecture. And only with the years, I've realized how much they knew about their surroundings, how much they loved their surroundings. And I hope I can honor their memory today by transmitting some of the things they have taught me. And not just them, I think we are indebted to other teachers. And as we try and do this work, what I'm going to be doing today is an exercise of Sammling. Sammling in Yiddish means kind of collection. My goal in this conversation and this lecture is to collect lots of stories, resources, and ideas from Jewish history and the Jewish present to try and point us in wider directions when it comes to what we could do ecologically. Too often, especially in Jewish spaces, what I found is the approach towards ecology is one that I call Control F approaches to ecology. You know, when you're in a computer, you want to find something, you put Control F and you put in a word and you find it. And so people can go back to the Talmud and say, you know, okay, where in the Talmud can I find anything environmental? Rather than understanding reality as an ecological reality, that even Judaism, it's not so much a case of thinking about Judaism and ecology, but Judaism as ecology. So my hope is to borrow the spirit of Dubnov, who famously encouraged Jews towards the end of the 19th century and early 20th century to collect the materials of our culture that were being lost to modernity, that were being lost to stories of racism. And the process of Sammling is an attempt to make sure that we honor all the gems of the past, the songs, the stories, because there may be riches there that might serve us for the challenges of the future. And Dubnov had a revolutionary impact all across Yiddish land. And one of the main people he influenced was the Yiddish playwright Szymanski, who you will see here looking very elegant in the middle. Right next to Szymanski, you might recognize is Sholem Aleichem, the famous Yiddish storyteller. Fiddler on the Roof is inspired obviously by the works of Sholem Aleichem. But Ansky was very inspired by Dubnov's work, and he created the first Jewish ethnographic expedition. So this was a team of Jewish researchers working and going all across the shtetls of Eastern Europe, primarily Ukraine and Belarus today, to find stories, wisdom, practices, ideas that could help nourish the Jewish people in times of crisis. So what Ansky did was take his collaborators all over the shtetls with some of the earliest recording technologies. The first Jewish songs we have recordings of come from the Ansky expedition. Here you have one image of the expedition. And unlike the European colonial expeditions that took place all over the world, this expedition had something different. These were not Europeans going off to far off places, often with a very racist gaze, interviewing people they had no connection with. These were people interviewing their grandparents, their family members. Here you see an image of the ethnographer Avrom Rechman interviewing his grandfather in a shtetl in Western Ukraine. So it was a very intimate process of research. But what motivated that research and why might it speak to us today? I found this beautiful quote by Ansky explaining his work, talking about the Jewish people. And I'll quote and read it out for you, which is that a nation does not live by suffering, but by a conscious rapture of itself, by joyful creation, by pride in its culture, and by the poetry of its everyday life. Only by all these things. If all these things were not present, the Jewish people would have ceased to exist long ago. So in the spirit of inspiration from Dubnov, from Ansky, from all these incredible elders of the tradition, what do we need to do today? What materials do we need to initiate that kind of process or reinitiate that process of joyful creation, but in an ecological key? That's my hope today, my humble hope. I hope I can do a tiny bit of it. And the broader question that I explore in my research is, could the transnational experiences, the memories and the life worlds of diasporas, such as the Jewish diaspora, offer us tools and imaginations to better confront the planetary crisis? And following Jacques Rancière, if politics is about knowing where change can happen, what could diasporic ecological politics teach us about both unfolding and possible changes in the future? So these are just broad questions to have in mind. Let's embark on our journey. So when we think about diasporas, when we think about ecology, often people think a lot about place, about a territory, about a particular part of the world, about land. But diasporas, because of their stories of migration, the focus, as Paul Gilroy reminds us, is less on territory and more on memory, the practices, the dynamics of how we remember what we remember. So memory becomes an incredible important tissue, a political plastic that we use to remember, to learn, to understand what to do in the current moment. The consciousness, the lifeblood of diaspora in many ways can be considered to be memory. Now, moving into the ecological space, why is memory important? The work of many ecologists, such as the Mexican ecologist Narciso Barrera Basols and Victor Toledo, reminds us of the importance of biocultural memory in tackling the climate crisis. What do we mean by biocultural memory? They're all the stories, the knowledges, and the practices we know about how to relate to the environment. Every community around the world, simply to survive, carries biocultural memory. And many forms of biocultural memory are incredibly medicinal for our planet. This is one example. This image shows the Chinampa system. It's a system of agrodiversity developed in central Mexico. And it's an incredible model for nourishing agriculture in the context of a swampy land. So the Chinampa is one example that's often used from biocultural memory. But if we look all over the world, the most ecologically rich, biodiverse parts of the planet are spaces with intense biocultural memory. The old school colonial understanding of protected nature is one without humans. Because if humans are this plague, this destructive species who are short-termist in their nature, then of course, national parks need to be places without human beings. But this is not the case. Research, both from the scientific field, but also from storytelling and oral archives, shows us that in fact, there is a mutually symbiotic relationship between human diversity and biological diversity. It is no mistake that the most biodiverse parts of the planet, such as the Amazon and Papua New Guinea, happen to be some of the most linguistically and culturally diverse parts of the planet. The Amazon, for example, is the way it is because of the work of human beings to nourish, to enhance the diversity of that biome over generations. And this is confirmed especially by some research that's been done in the last 10, 15 years by the biologist Eduardo Neves. I'll give you one example, which you can see here, which is the phenomenon of terra preta. The earth of the Amazon is particularly rich and particularly fertile, not because it was that way, but because human beings have encouraged and enriched that. The phenomenon of terra preta is the result of indigenous communities over generations using different techniques of charring to enhance and expand the capacity of the land to generate a wider diversity of plants, especially medicinal plants. So biocultural memory, medicinal biocultural memory, stories, understandings of how to nourish land is incredibly important. Now, you may say, well, this makes sense in indigenous communities, but what would it look like to think through the biocultural memory of diaspora communities? And I think there's lots to think about. I've taken two images here, one from the Armenian theater, which has been a space in which the Armenian diaspora has used. Theater is incredibly important in many diaspora communities, especially in the Jewish diaspora, as a space of storytelling, of knowledge transmission, and forms of spirituality. On the left, you have an image of candomblé, a ceremony of candomblé, Afro-Brazilian diasporic spirituality. There are many spaces we can look to understand how diaspora communities transmit memory, nourish memory. And so if I leave you with one thing, is that memory has a medicinal role to play. And we need to think a bit more about biocultural memory. And diasporas in particularly, as Edouard Glissant, the Martinican philosopher, reminds us, a diaspora is a passage from unity to multiplicity. And if we're serious about confronting monocultures and creating the polycultures the ecological crisis requires us to do, then diaspora could teach us a lot about what it means to nourish, to honor plurality and diversity. Here we go. As the Black geographer Catherine McKitterick writes, diaspora geography is not the act of making maps. Rather, it is the act of sharing ideas about where liberation is and might be. This is a beautiful work by the Iraqi artist Samir Farouk called Library of Flatbreads. It's about all the different communities, diaspora communities in Montreal, and the different kinds of flatbreads they produce. So a very specific, all food is a type of biocultural memory as well, an understanding of how to nourish, cook, assemble food. And here you have a beautiful art piece which shows the range of diasporic biocultural memory in the city of Montreal through bread. So I hope things are a little bit clear right now, and if they're confusing, that's also good. But I'll just break down a little bit more about why diasporic ecological thinking is important before we move into the substance of today. All across the climate conversation, diasporas are implicit. We know that the climate crisis is displacing millions of people around the world. And we also know that diasporas are the main providers of what is called climate finance, finance to support communities affected by climate change. In the Pacific, in the Caribbean, diaspora communities are larger than the communities of their homelands. So, for example, in many islands in the Caribbean, the diaspora communities living in the United States, for example, are often the first people to provide resources to communities when hurricanes hit. So diasporas are fundamental already in how the world is tackling the climate crisis. But also, I think there's a lot more there. Diasporas offer us, as Judith Butler asks us to think about, an ethics of cohabitation. How do we live in a world with different peoples? How do we honor our own culture while honoring the culture of our environment? How do we live with others? That's the principal question in a way of ecology. How do we live with others and honor our relations? And a lot of Jewish thinking, I think, through its reflections on cohabitation, on otherness and difference, offers us a lot of tools and ideas to think about deeper questions of ecology and migration. And learning from the work of especially many Afro-diasporic thinkers, through diasporic culture, not only do we try and think outside the state, especially with the state blocking so much climate action around the world, but also it's an attempt to reforest the imagination of the world. Diasporic culture produces diversity. And in a moment where our imaginations feel so enclosed by the horrific violences we're seeing, diasporic thinking can maybe offer us a little bit of an escape route. So overall, by looking at diasporas, their history, their present, we might find examples of inspiring social ecological movements, of different horizons, different ways of thinking, and even knowledges of herbalism, medicine, plants, and botany and biology that might help us find some tools for this moment. So that's just a broad summary about diasporas in general. Let's come back a little bit more home and think about why study Jewish diasporic ecology, why suggest it. Diaspora is a fundamental foundation of Jewish culture over thousands of years. We have this incredible archive. We have thousands of years of experience of resistance to forms of oppression, to adaptation to very difficult conditions. And so by looking at it, by finding different tools, I think there's a lot we can find. So, and additionally, Jewish diasporic thinking has been used by many communities to defend their own rights, to find their own place in a world of oppression. As Paul Gilroy reminds us, it's often forgotten that the term diaspora goes into the vocabulary of Black studies and Black liberation thought and Pan-Africanist politics from Jewish thought. We can't forget that one of the most important Afro-American intellectuals of all time gained enormous understanding through collaborations with Jewish intellectuals, thinking through the question of diaspora. And in his reflection upon visiting the remains of the Warsaw Ghetto, W.E.B. Du Bois said very clearly that his understanding was not so much a clear understanding of the Jewish problem in the world, as it was a real and more complete understanding of the Negro problem. So diasporic thinking offers us a bridge between peoples as well. We are all trying to find each other in translation, and I think that diasporic ecological thinking can be one of those bridges. Okay, so to move into what I'll be talking about, I'll be trying to trace how some ideas around ecology, some movements around ecology, found their way in Yiddish land, in Eastern Europe, before the Holocaust, and made their way into the Americas, where they continue in different variations, and try to give you, expand maybe the repertoire of what we imagine has been possible in terms of Jewish ecological thinking over time. So I'll start with a question, which is, do any of us know of any Jewish ecological movements from the 1920s or 1930s? Most times when I answer this question, the answer is no. People might think a little bit about the Activism and different movements that try to embed a kind of agricultural and environmental ethic. But often there are many, many other movements at the beginning of the 20th century that are forgotten about. I'll bring in one. Oh, I skipped one second here. Just before I move into this, I would say that, of course, we're working with a lot of destruction. The impact of the Holocaust, the mass destruction of so many communities, means we're often left with an enormous act of erasure. But I think the invitation is to think beyond the catastrophe, to look backwards and think about what was there, what was lost, and what can we learn from it. Let's start with this movement. In the 1920s and 1930s, one of the most powerful youth movements all across Poland was the land contenish movement, the land knowledge movement. This was a movement primarily made up of young people who wanted to ensure that urban Jews, many of them living in nature poverty, in very squalid conditions, with poor hygiene, had access to nature, could learn about forests and biology, but also learn the Jewish history of the Polish land. As they saw Polish nationalism rising and fascism rising, they saw very quickly how fascists could rewrite the entire history of a land and erase the stories of the different plural peoples that lived there. So the land knowledge movement was an attempt to get people to know the land, to feel part of the land, to feel pride for their ancestors having lived in that land, but especially to build a historical consciousness using ecology for young generations in Poland. And what's quite interesting is that some of the leaders of the land contenish movement would become some of the most important memory workers in Holocaust Poland. So here we have an image of some of the leaders of the land contenish movement. Yiddishists might recognize the poet Itzik Manger first from the left, but I want to focus on the two figures, firstly on the far left, Emanuel Ringelblum, and the woman Rachel Auerbach that you can find third from the left. Two fascinating figures. Why are these figures important? Because we know so little about what actually went down in the ghettos during the Holocaust. Some of the best memory work was the work that was done by the ecological movements, by members of the land knowledge movement. Emanuel Ringelblum, one of the key members of the land knowledge movement, was single-handedly responsible for creating the collective known as Oynek Shabbos, a clandestine collective that in the fury of the Warsaw Ghetto collected memory from all the community, stories, novels, poems, music songs, sermons, and they buried it underneath the ghetto to be recovered at the end of the war. Very few members of the Oynek Shabbos collective survived, but one of them, Rochoy Auerbach, who I'll talk about in a second, one of the members of the land knowledge movement, survived and was responsible for digging out the archives. I was always left with the question, how is it that some of the people who had the foresight to understand what the Nazis would do with memory were those involved in ecological memory work? It's always been a question I have. I don't really have an answer, but I think it's an interesting story to tell, that people involved in land memory work knew the danger of telling stories about the land that excluded the plural stories of that land, and therefore, faced with fascism, understood the importance of protecting their own stories, knowing where they were heading for future generations to recover. Rachel Auerbach eventually migrated to Israel, would become a pioneer in the use of victim testimony in war crimes and genocide trials, and in fact started working in the first years of Yad Vashem before she was removed from Yad Vashem. Why? Because she wasn't academic enough. Her approach on victim-centered testimony and victim-centered memory was biased and didn't respect male academic protocols. But Rachel Auerbach was a fascinating figure, one that emerges from ecological movements in the 1920s Poland to become a huge, huge pioneer of the role of testimony in war crimes trials. I want to take us to something even more, though. What were people thinking about when it came to ecology? And this is one of the most beautiful diagrams that I've been blessed to find in the archives. I'll talk about where this diagram is from in a second, but I want to introduce you to the Medem Sanatorium. The Medem Sanatorium was established by the Jewish Labor Bund in 1926 in the outskirts of Warsaw. Set up by trade unions, it became the pioneering institution for the treatment of tuberculosis in children. Over 10,000 children, mostly Jewish, but some non-Jewish Polish children, were treated in the sanatorium. And what was exceptional about the sanatorium, which gave it some of the highest results for tuberculosis treatment in the world, was the fact that children were in charge of the sanatorium. Because the belief of the doctors who set up the sanatorium was that children could only heal a difficult disease like tuberculosis if they were encouraged to want to live, to want to take power over their lives, to want to contribute to society, to be part of society. So the Medem Sanatorium became the gold standard institution for the treatment of tuberculosis in the world, established, set up by working class movements from all across Poland. Now, what's interesting about the Medem Sanatorium as well is it was the first center for climate research set up by children. You have an image here, which is the meteorological research station at the Medem Sanatorium. Patients at the Medem Sanatorium were encouraged to be scientists, doctors, and researchers of their own disease. It's a fascinating example of what happens when children are given power over their own health and healing. And at the Medem Sanatorium, children ran in the agroecological garden, they ran their own leisure center, they ran their own school, all assisted and guided by radical pedagogues at the time, like Anna Braude, for example, who leave us a fascinating model of what ecological land-based healing looks like in the 1920s and 1930s. So when we think about what was possible back then, often these institutions don't come to mind. And the image that I shared with you beforehand, this image, which is like an Eitz Chaim, tree of life, is the diagram showing the organizing structure of the Children's Council of the Medem Sanatorium in Yiddish. It has different branches, including culture, hygiene, and the basis is the Children's Council of the Medem Sanatorium. So an ecological diagram showing how children understood the organizing structure of their own sanatorium run by the children. If that's one model from the past that we might want to learn from, I would leave you with just the Medem Sanatorium. Let's move on to other examples. I can come back to the Medem Sanatorium in the past. I want to talk a bit about shtetls. Shtetls are often used in a kind of very romantic, nostalgic, kind of figurative way. Either we kind of, as many have reflected on, there's a spectrum. Either we dip into highly romanticized Fiddler on the Roof style depictions of shtetls, or a highly, highly cynical idea, these backwaters when nothing good happened. And in fact, the truth is much more in between. But what is interesting about shtetls is that they developed, because of the regulations and restrictions on Jews, to really be in the middle of what is urban and what is rural. As the world is trying to recover a model of urbanism, which is much more at peace with the natural world, shtetls offer us fascinating stories and ideas of how people actually felt deeply immersed with their surroundings. Growing up, I was often told a story that Judaism was somehow very far away from nature. It was an urban, cosmopolitan religion, way of thinking. that actually had a lot of work to do to recover its own connection with ecology. But in fact, when you come and look at shtetl stories or shtetl basically narratives depicting what shtetl life was like, you get a very different picture of what I was raised with. And in fact, if I can use and turn Hannah Arendt's turn, what we find is that ecological thinking was incredibly banal. It's all over the place. It's not that we have to look very, very hard. One of the best sources for this is what are called pinkasim. So pinkasim were the community chronicles, especially of Jewish communities. One beautiful story that I've heard from shtetls in many different sources is that the midwives in shtetls would take the pinkasim when women were giving birth to their children, because the idea was that a pinkasim would protect the baby against any harm. The story, the oral memory written down of the community would protect that child. Now, pinkasim, many of them were destroyed, some of them were protected, especially by the works of Simon Dubnov, but pinkasim contained community stories and ideas and chronicles of what life was like, especially before the Holocaust. This tradition really kind of ended with the Yisrobuchen. These are the memory books that were produced by many, many shtetls, by the few survivors that survived. But if you look into these memory books, and if you look into the pinkasim, what we find is many, many stories of deep love, of connection, of admiration, of enjoyment of the land. As this one from the memorial book of Rozniatov in Galicia says, on the Sabbaths and festivals of the summer, almost all city inhabitants, young and old, spent time on the hill or in the forest. The songs of the youth could be heard in the whole shtetl. In another reflection, here we have the testimony of Chaim Shabach. We have a reflection showing huge enjoyment as well from the beauties of nature, an abundance of connections with all kinds of animals roaming around through the cities and towns. I have a whole range of quotes. I could give you hundreds from these, but what we have is in many of the sources depictions of rivers as midwives, of rivers as lovers, a deeply, almost erotic sometimes, poetic connection with ecological surroundings that is abundant all across the literature. I want to bring you to this quote made from the Yitzchak book of the Shtetl of Antopo, which says, "It is a well-known truth that everyone brings up that we Jews were uprooted from the earth. And certainly we are missing a wide layer of real farmers who earn their living from the earth. However, the foundation of the earth was not entirely missing from the people and their occupation. This was especially true of the inhabitants of the suburbs who were known to be poor. They needed the produce of their gardens and animals. They kept the backbone of their attachment to the earth. They were never cut off in their conversation and in all their innocent surrounding from the life of the village." Anyways, it goes on to depict the story of someone who had a deep connection with animals, but all of this is abundant across the tradition. Even when we think about great learning institutions, at least in Ashkenaz, we often think of them as these great yeshivas, when actually, when you look at the depictions, what they were is in small towns, often located next to forests or really inside forests. So re-ecologizing, reimagining what life used to be like in far deeper proximity with seasons and nature, I think can help us retell some of the stories that we've grown up with. Here's an image of the Volozhin yeshiva, one of the most famous yeshivas of Ashkenaz. There are many testimonies where people would simply study by going for walks in the forest, by listening and learning from the birds. So hopefully some of these fragments can change a little bit how we might think about this particular, maybe boring or stale shtetl experience, when in fact it was far more enchanted with ecological connection. In the book Bochani by Chava Rosenfarb, one of the great Yiddish novelists, we even have depictions of the fact that in many shtetls, the time, the calendar, was obviously marked by the Jewish calendar, but also by the arrival and departure of storks. The day they returned was the first day of summer, and the day they left was the first day of winter. So profound connections with animals, and storks had a very mythical, powerful representation in much of Yiddish storytelling as well.
What's it?
Yeah, was there a question? Or
We just lost you with the stock. You were.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yeah.
Now it's okay.
Yes. No,
Now
you're
I'm back.
No, you're
Nice.
back.
Okay. And another place I'd encourage people to look is simply at art and art movements. All across, especially within the beginning of the 1920s, you have an explosion of incredible ecological artwork being produced in many, many centers of the Jewish world. I also want to coming back to very mainstream figures. People often depict Chagall in this kind of, as if he's depicting highly mythical, ideologized landscapes. And in Chagall's own interview, he said he was simply depicting folktales, the stories, the ordinary understandings that people had, where animals were enchanted beings, where forests had spirits of their own. You find this all across Chagall's work, and Chagall, for his exceptional talents, wasn't an exceptional different figure from many of the artists he was part of. So we can see, obviously, incredible ecological, enchanting images all across Chagall's work. Going back to what I said, there's a banality of Jewish ecology. It's so hiding in plain sight in a way. And in fact, when we see so many depictions of cows and goats in Chagall's work, often, you can read articles saying, wow, exploring the figure of goats in Chagall, what could it mean? What does it mean? Well, a very basic reading is that in many shtetl homes, there simply were a huge abundance of goats and cows living there. They were part of the landscape. They were part of the family in many conditions. They were a source of warmth, of heating, of food. So going back to these images can be a way of relocating ourselves in the ecological trajectories that many communities have been on. As this quote from Chagall himself says, in the evening under the bridge, I loved my river, the Dvina, which flows through Vitebsk, his hometown. I had to love climbing onto the roof to see a fire that colors the sky red, to see a fantastical world, more real than reality. And that's why I got lost in the river of lines and dots in my etchings, searching for the dead souls of my homeland. There's a lot more we can talk about ecology in Chagall. I want to briefly talk about one of his main pupils after the Russian Revolution in 1918, from 1918 to 1919, Chagall was catapulted from an outcast as a Jewish man growing up in Tsarist Russia to the head of art of the town of Vitebsk. He was in charge of carnivals, he was in charge of murals, and he created an own popular art school. And one of his most beloved pupils was a 14-year-old called Lazar Hidekel, who became an architect at the age of 14. And a lot of what people talk about today as ecological architecture, nature-based architecture, was scribbled by Lazar in his drawings already 100 years ago. You have lots of work commemorating the work of Lazar Hidekel as one of the pioneers of ecological architecture, all based and inspired by his work in the popular art school of Vitebsk in the shtetl. So these are just some figures that hopefully can help stimulate our imagination. A lot of work has also been done to think about what were the medicinal, herbal traditions of people living in towns. I can talk a lot more about this, but I would just encourage, if people are interested, there's a wonderful book called Ashkenazi Herbalism, which has a second volume, which just come out. And while this is not my focus, a lot of work has also been done thinking through Sephardic stories of herbalism, of understanding the power of plants to heal, to also remove enchantments or create enchantments. But there's an enormous source here, thinking through people's medicinal relationship with plants and the more than human world. And many people also researching, again, going back to the banality, one of the most important rabbis in the last 300 years, arguably the founder of Hasidism, Baal Shem Tov, was a traditional folk healer, known as the rabbi of the forest, known for encouraging people to immerse themselves in their natural surroundings in order to find healing and connection with divinity. The reality is that the ecological spirit is abundant all across Jewish history. It's maybe a case of rubbing our glasses anew and finding the banality that's often hiding, not just in plain sight, but in plain sound. And this is a story that I often add, again, to kind of like spice it up a little bit. It's not common for people to imagine that in shtetls, people had a lot of gender-affirming, liberating care. But this is an article found in 1936, written by Yeshaya Katovsky, who was criticizing. He wrote a letter into the Vorwärts in Yiddish. This Vorwärts wrote an article talking about the new innovations in gender-affirming care for people who wanted to transition from one sex to another happening in Europe. And Yeshaya said, look, this isn't new. I found this in my shtetl over 40 years ago. We had people that wanted to change because they identified in a particular way. And the whole shtetl was very comfortable with it and supportive of it. So I'm not trying to paint a picture of all shtetls as this kind of incredibly progressive, fascinating arena. There was huge amounts of violence and oppression and misery. But I think that if we change the stories a little bit and imagine that all kinds of things were possible, we might find more footholds to imagine many more things to be possible in our difficult present. I can talk more about this later on, though. So I think that the past, at least from Yiddish movements, offers us all kinds of different things, from doikait, which is the politics of here-ness, diasporism, of belonging to the land you're on, a politics of daikait, which is cultivating enoughness and sufficiency, quite important, the politics of Yerusha, of heritage, of using stories from the past to re-enchant our generations who want to behave in reparative ways, to forms of radical ecological healing. But I would also want to invite us more into the present, reminding us that the act of looking back, of looking at the past with fresh eyes, of entering a text from an old text from a new critical direction, as Adrian Rich reminds us, is more than a chapter in cultural history. It is an act of survival. So what did people do when they migrated from their shtetls? What did they carry? What ideas, what forms of practice and organizing did they carry? My research looks a lot at how radical Jewish movements, particularly from Poland, took some of their ideas into the Americas, into Argentina and Brazil, and created legacies that remain with us today. Because diasporas travel, families migrate, stories move across places, but memory remains a powerful force. And one of the main institutions I study is called Casa de Povo. Casa de Povo is a cultural center that was set up as a living monument by Polish Jewish refugees to the city of Sao Paulo. They wanted to create a monument to their murdered ancestors and relatives in the Holocaust. And they said, we do not want a monument to death, we want a monument to life. And so they created a cultural center that would be a cultural center for the Yiddish-speaking community, but a cultural center also for all peoples. And today, Casa de Povo is, as one of the lead directors explains, it's a Jewish place which remains radically open to all, ranging from migratory communities and movements to minorities and the unseen, Black people, Indigenous people, Latinos, and LGBTQIAPN plus peoples. It is a space which today serves as a cultural center, a space of healing, a space where farmers deliver their products to the local community, a space that hosts the cultural initiatives, not just the Jewish community, but also of the Bolivian community, of the Korean community, of all the different diasporas that make home in the old Jewish neighborhood of Bom Retiro. So this is a fascinating space built by Yiddish movements as a space that would be a home for all. And increasingly has also become a home for the indigenous peoples displaced from Sao Paulo. So to me, it's a fascinating example of a Jewish space practicing an ethics of cohabitation, of living with each other, that I think remains a fascinating example for our present on what does a Jewish ecological ethic look like today. Here are some images from Sao Paulo. And this isn't the only radical, interesting ecological initiative that we can find all across Brazil, at least. One of the most interesting figures that we find moving from Yiddish land to Brazil is someone called Noel Nutels. Noel Nutels was a Ukrainian Jewish doctor who, as soon as he arrived in Brazil, asked himself, who are the Jews of Brazil? Who are the people facing conditions of oppression? And he concluded that it was the indigenous peoples of Brazil. So Noel Nutels said, as a diasporic Jew, my obligation is to support the Jews of Brazil, who I consider to be the indigenous peoples. Noel Nutels was one of the single-handedly responsible non-indigenous people who pushed for the creation of the Xingu Community Park, one of the first national parks in the world that did not remove indigenous people, but included them in the creation of the park and protected their rights. And to this day, Noel Nutels is considered an example of what it means to be supporting efforts to protect the Amazon and the rights of indigenous peoples. There's a wonderful film, which in English would translate to The White-Skinned Indian Against the Invisible Beast. And it's all about the work of Noel Nutels to support public health and to practice his own Judaism as being of deep accompliceness, of deep allyship with the indigenous peoples of Brazil. But we can also look towards more mainstream examples. When we think about Jewish ecological thinking, we also have to think about literature and the work of Ukrainian-born Jewish writer Clarice Lispector, to me, whose work constantly moves into questioning what is alive and what is not, into thinking through the voices of plants, of animals, of spirits, to me is a fascinating space to learn. We could have another whole day conversation about ecology and ecological thinking in the work of Lispector. But Lispector single-handedly, with her strange Portuguese, as many literary critics say, that strangeness comes from the product of growing up in a Yiddish-speaking environment and translating and moving between languages in her youth, as the critic Benjamin Motter documents. But I think Lispector, as a mainstream example of fascinating ecological literature, is someone that we can also turn to. I'll give you a few more names. I won't go into depth, but the work of Claudia Andújar, Nurit Ben-Suzan are also two different Jewish artists and writers and academics at the forefront of ecological thinking in Brazil. Nurit Ben-Suzan is a biologist who defines herself as an ex-human, educated in Brazil and in Israel, who works at the creation of encounter ecologies, ecologies that connect peoples across borders, asking us to be in deep encounter with the world around us. And Claudia Andújar, who also survived the Holocaust, migrated to Brazil, and understood her obligation to be with the Yanomami people in Brazil facing genocide. These are, to me, fascinating examples, not role models, but possibility models, models that can help expand the repertoire of who we think is doing Jewish ecology and what Jewish ecology looks like. I'll leave you with two additional names: Andrea Gamarnik, educated in the Yiddish school system in Buenos Aires, and now one of the leading researchers of dengue and tropical diseases, whose frequency and range is expanding because of climate change, and Michał Lowy, an Austrian-Brazilian eco-socialist philosopher who's one of the main proponents of the Green New Deal, of economic packages that can advance ecological justice. All of these people were nourished and educated by Jewish community institutions, credit Jewish diasporic thinking as part of their work, but have traveled and moved and crossed borders in that work. I want to also bring another example from the present that I think is a fascinating one to think through. This is Linke Fliegel. Linke Fliegel is a Yiddish farm that was developed in upstate New York. And Linke adopted the old Shemitah calendar, which is the idea that after 6 years, the land is laid to rest for its seventh year. What did Linke do? They created a 7-year project to restore a huge amount of land in upstate New York. And on the 7th year, they let the land rest and they returned the land as part of an act of teshuvah to the indigenous custodians of that land, trying to experiment and implement what does it look like to create Jewish ecological regenerative projects in the Americas, in solidarity with the peoples whose land has been robbed. This is another fascinating example I encourage people to look towards. We have the work of the artist Julie Weitz, who's a friend of some of the people in the room. Julie Weitz uses figures from Yiddish folklore to talk to contemporary issues. On the right, I think I would really recommend for people who are interested to explore her work, which is a prayer for endangered forests, which imagines what would a golem reincarnated do in the forest fires of Western California. And so it's a fascinating use of different forms from Jewish folklore to think through how these forms, these spirits, these forms of strength could be used to encourage people attend the crises today. And finally, there's a lot more I could talk about. I'm happy to talk in the questions. I'm also trained as a musician, and I think that Jewish music and the stories of Jewish musicians offer us fascinating models as well for ecology. Why? Because often in music and musicality, we're talking about what Izali Samsovsky, the Jewish musicologist, invited us to think with the melosphere. For human beings, we share the atmosphere, but we also share the melosphere, which is the shared space of melodies and music and rhythms across all cultures. It is an enormous space of exchange, of transformation. Music moves the world, and Jewish musicians have been building bridges across borders for generations, across all kinds of genres. So I'm going to just mention some of my favorite musicians, not because they were ecologists per se, but because their technique, their way of crossing genres, their way of nourishing diversity, to me offers fascinating tools for thinking through the role of arts in ecological thinking. But also because many researchers, including the Talmudist Daniel Boyarin, talk about music not just as what is played by instruments, but musicality. Music as part of the poetry of everyday life, as Ansky said. Talmudic study, the study of Jewish sources, is filled with a way of thinking about rhythm and melody and counterpoint. At the end of the day, as the philosopher Arnold Zweig reminds us, a Jew thinks with their ear. To open our ears, to listen deeply, to listen twice, as the Zohar reminds us, is an attempt to remind us that the first thing we hear may not be the first thing that is true. And across all of Jewish music, not all of it, that's an overstatement, but so much of Jewish music, what we have are border musics, our bridges, our combinations, our ways of letting what is supposedly disharmonious become harmonious, of taking the minor and mixing it with the major. In the case of klezmer, as the klezmer musician Frank Lund reminds us, it's a bridging of the makam system of the Ottoman Empire with a harmonic system of Western music. And this form of finding harmony across difference, of finding possibility in honoring different traditions, to me is the gesture of what Jewish diasporic ecological politics can do. I think that there are huge examples that we can find in the work of Gershwin, in the work of Benny Goodman, as people who crossed bridges, who crossed boundaries and built ways for people to relate across sound. I think it was huge things that we can learn from the work of Larry Harlow. Larry Harlow is one of the most beloved salsa musicians of all time, from an Orthodox Jewish family, and now considered in many Afro-Cuban communities, El Judío Maravilloso, the marvelous Jew. If you hear any salsa recordings and you're confused because you hear a shout out to the marvelous Jew, it's because they're calling out Larry Harlow. What did Larry Harlow do? Coming from an Orthodox background, he first went and studied with Arsenio Rodriguez, who's considered the father of salsa, and said, I want to be in honor of his Afro-Cuban spirituality, and as a Jew, it's my obligation to listen and to uphold. And that gesture of listening and upholding the other, to me, is something that we can come back to, whether it's in music, whether it's in ecology. Here's another image of Larry Harlow a little bit later in life. And we can have other examples, the work of Algerian musician Lili Boniche, integrating habaneras and tango into traditional music from Algeria and North Africa. We find it in the work of Rosa Eskenazi, braiding across so many different traditions to become the diva of Rebettica. And we find it in the work of Leonid Utyosov, who smuggled in supposedly foreign capitalist music, of jazz music into the Soviet Union, and became a pioneer of the fusions of jazz, traditional Russian, Ukrainian folklore, and klezmer. All these gestures of mixing and honoring, to me, is also part of an ecological politics. So I think we can turn to different musicians today and think about what are they doing to encourage ancestral futurism, to encourage an ecological ethic. I would remind you, going back to core Jewish Brazilians, one of the most prominent samba musicians is a trans Sephardic from a Moroccan family artist called Azucena Azucena. who is constantly asking for a deeper brotherhood between Jews and all kinds of peoples across Brazil. If there's any, I know we're in an academic space. Azucena is the only person I know of who gets away with having a column in Vogue magazine, with columns such as this one. Why is it important to question the false idea of a Judeo-Christian West? I can't think of any other Vogue columnists with that kind of material. So I would encourage you to check out Azucena. Azucena, and also the work of, for example, Misha Galperin. Misha Galperin is a Russian Moldovan Jewish artist who recently passed away, long blessed be his memory. And what he would do is create folklore for the future. He would bring different indigenous communities across Russia together to create hymns for the future, to create what he saw as an application of klezmer into the future. If klezmer is finding harmony in disharmony, is building bridges between scales, then next level klezmer is doing it across communities. And so Misha Galperin's work was to bring klezmer across traditions. Another, I think, ecological gesture. We find similar work being done by Laura, the amazing Laura Elkeslasi today, and Daniel Kahn. I know I've gone on for a while, but I can come back to them a little bit later on if we're interested. But essentially, musicians and artists have a lot that they can teach us about what it means to be ecological in a world that is creolizing and pluralizing. I want to come back to a conclusion. What are we trying to do here? At the end of the day, we're trying to build, to reforest a pluriverse, a world where many worlds fit, as the Zapatistas say. As Arturo Escobar reminds us, the understanding of the world is much broader than the Western understanding of the world. And this means that the transformation of the world and the civilizational transitions adumbrated by the many indigenous, peasant, and Afro-descendant activists might happen along pathways that might be unthinkable from the perspective of Eurocentric theories. We need to understand Judaism without Judeocentrism. We have to understand Europe without Eurocentrism. And we have to understand the ecological crisis, not just thinking through the more crude and formal terms of ecology. The whole world is implicated, the whole world is responsible, the whole world carries possibilities of transformations. So if you're interested in this idea of the pluriverse, here are some books that you might enjoy. And finally, going back to the process of learning through others, I would also really think that we can't study Jewish diasporic ecology just through Jewish thinking and thought, given the constant cross-pollination of ideas that happens as part of the diasporic experience. So I want to recommend some books that come from incredible diasporic ecological thinkers from other diasporas, from the work of Laila Fegali, thinking through healing cultures and plant stories from Palestine to Lebanon to Egypt, to the incredible work of thinkers such as Alexis Pauline Guns from the Caribbean. And finally, I want to come back to some reflections coming from one of the most important diasporic ecological thinkers, Nego Bispo, Antonio Bispo dos Santos, coming from the Quilombolas of Brazil. And he identifies something very clear. At the core of the ecological crisis is what he calls cosmophobia, a terror of the world, a terror before the diversity of life, before the plurality of worlds. We might identify the problem as colonialism, as capitalism. And at the core, on an emotional level, though, Nego Bispo asks us to confront cosmophobia, to confront that fear of plurality, and to remember that the goal isn't development, it's envelopment. It's wrapping ourselves around the ecologies that have birthed us and nourishing us. And when it comes to working across borders, Nego Bispo asks us to look at rivers. And he says, two rivers, when they come together, they don't lose the original river they are. They become a more stronger river. And that is how peoples work together through the process of confluence. And we learn confluence through rivers. I would leave you with Nego Bispo. There's so much more to learn from him. And so this is the process that many diasporic thinkers are proposing, a process of counter-colonization, of balancing the civilizations of the world, of balancing the peoples, the different beings of the world, of beginning to learn from each other in new and reparative ways. So I hope that this very, very hardy, quick, intense journey across many, many ideas has left you with something. I come back to the words of Rav Volkovsky from 1952, coming back to the figure of Jewish and Yiddish culture as a bird, which is that the strength of the bird lies in its wings. And Jewish culture has this power to fly from place to place and be saved from destruction. And I would add to fly from place to place, to listen, to learn, to teach, to offer, to inspire, to encourage. And finally, I come back to where we began, to this image where we look up and we remind ourselves that some of the shores of the past had a lot more color than contemporary ones. They invited us to dream, to look upwards, to think about all the different beings of the world. And I want to finish with a beautiful teaching from an old Yiddish children's song, von der Wurzel, which is a very, very simple song, but it tells the story that from a root comes a tree. And it's been that way since the creation of the heaven and the earth. And then it goes again, from a tree comes a branch, and it's been that way since the beginning of the creation of the heaven and the earth. And from that branch comes a twig, and it's been that way from the beginning of the creation of the heaven and the earth. And from that twig comes the creation of a nest, and it's been that way since the beginning of the heaven and the earth. And from a nest comes a bird, and it's been that way since the beginning of the creation of the heaven and the earth. And from the bird comes a feather, and that feather has been that way since the beginning of the creation of the heaven and the earth. And from the feather comes a pillow, and it has been that way since the beginning of the creation of heaven and the earth. And from the pillow comes a dream. Thank you for joining me in this dream of memory, and I look forward to learning more together.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Daniel. Really fascinating. I will open it to comments, questions. It was very dense and very rich, yes. And we appreciate. It's like you also presented a kind of knowledge resource. So we will appreciate if you could share the presentation, because there are many things that worthy of diving into. No, lots of text and the books. And for me, it was also, personally, it was fascinating because you addressed the whole issue not from the canonical texts, but from the angle of Jewish way of life, no? In a certain time. And the diasporical and the Eastern Europe shtetl culture. So it was really fascinating. Any questions? Online or here.
Comentario.
Comentarios.
Lo haré en castellano.
Vale, va bien.
Vale, hola Dani. ¿Me ves?
Sí.
Pues
Hola,
Dani
bueno.
ha estudiado en el Secolel, que ha sido una fuente de inspiración para muchas de las personas de tu generación, algunas mayores, que estamos acá. Mi comentario es así. Gracias por abrir un judaísmo que es el judaísmo universal, transversal, que no está centralizado en Israel y que nos abre también a soñar otro mundo y nuestros propios mundos, como tú dices, acá el judaísmo en la diáspora. Es genial toda la investigación sobre el mundo ashkenazí. Ojalá hubiese también una apertura, se lo digo así, mirando los ojos al cielo,
Ahí sí,
sobre, para el mundo sefaradí, mizraquí, sobre desde las raíces, desde la cultura. Y lo que más aprecio es ahora, en este mismo momento, es el amor con que has traído el judaísmo, que esos años han sido muy difíciles, y volver a reencontrarnos en ese lugar puro, como desde el origen. Así que nada, muchas gracias y todo mi amor. Sí.
questions.
Bueno.
I don't know if it's a question or a comment yet.
Let's see.
Going back to the shtetl, and I was wondering how different this connection you described between Jews, Judaism, and their environment, and then what you described as ecology, how much was it different from the surrounding communities, the Christian ones? I was just wondering, I don't know, because maybe I just already want to answer, but how much is the environment shaping us? Sometimes, I mean, at the time, maybe more than we were shaping it. And I want to transfer this question today to this day and age, and maybe, I don't know, for instance, we are in Barcelona, how much it's shaping us, or how much it has stopped to shape us.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I'll try answer from what I know, which is very little. I think there's probably people that are more equipped. But firstly, I would say, at least in the shtetls, it's very easy to generalize when every shtetl really has a life of its own. And even the word shtetl refers to basically just a town with a significant proportion of a Jewish population. But in what I've been able to research, firstly, I mean, Jews especially have different relationships with what animals they can have certain relationships with. And often in many shtetls, you would have a situation where Jews would be more living in the city center. The kind of agriculture that Jews were permitted to do in many cases wasn't so much large-scale agriculture. It was very much subsistence agriculture in their own plot, whereas non-Jewish populations would be living more in the outskirts and have the more quintessentially rural life, which is why shtetls, a lot of Jews were crafts people, were people involved in moving goods and all kinds of other occupations. So there was often a difference in terms of people's direct proximity to certain kinds of agriculture. But if you look at texts such as Ashkenazi herbalism, what you find is that there was significant points of encounter between populations, particularly around plants and medicine. One of the most interesting features that you have looking at shtetls is that the most trusted healers in Jewish communities weren't even Jewish healers. They were Tatar healers, Muslim Tatar healers, who were renowned for their capacity to heal different illnesses. And when it comes to plants, there was a huge exchange between communities about knowledge around plants. At the end of the day, people are human beings. The same people are the ones enjoying the same river. To say that there's a Jewish experience of experiencing the river and a non-Jewish experience is a bit absurd. But the metaphors that people were using to understand that experience, the metaphors of divinity, the metaphors, the names, the stories, the approaches, there's significant difference. But what's often interesting is if you go and really look into, for example, Ukrainian folklore, Western Ukrainian folklore is some of the most interesting folklore in Europe because Jewish heroes of folklore are very present in non-Jewish folklore. You have a lot of stories in Christian, in Orthodox Ukrainian and Catholic Ukrainian folklore of great rabbis being almost saintly. And vice versa. In Ukrainian Jewish folklore, you also have a lot of stories of incredible healers from the Hutzul community. And so there's a lot of exchange. And I think all this, I try and show that the past is open, as people say about the Talmud. The main principle of the Talmud is that the past is open. And similarly here, and even to the distinction between Ashkenazi and Sephardic, I don't speak so much about Sephardic experience because I don't feel I can, it's not my expertise. But to simply say that Ashkenaz is Ashkenazi, and when so many Sephardic texts were absolutely fundamental in the shaping of Ashkenazi life worlds, I remind people that Hillel Zeitlin, one of the most important rabbis of Ashkenaz in the early 20th century, went to Treblinka carrying a copy of the Zohar as his shield. That tells you a story to me about Sephardic prominence in Ashkenaz. And additionally, so many communities within Ashkenaz had, sometimes significant, sometimes not so significant Sephardic components. In fact, the Yiddish poet Peretz Markish, one of the greatest Yiddish poets, came from a Sephardic family. So I think not to question our distinctions too much, but I think that what I'm trying to do is open us a little bit more and see how can we continue learning in a way that reduces some of these divisions. But yeah, overall, I would say that what is beautiful about ecology is that it binds all of us together, irrespective of our origins. But maybe what we read in the landscape, the languages we read that landscape in, may be different.
No, I was asking because, when I went to Poland this summer, I was stricken how it was let's say the first time, because the time before, that was just a few days. And all the Ashkenazi food, or what they call in the state Jewish food, is basically Polish food. And apart from it's marginal what is specifically Jewish. So I was just wondering if in terms of as you say, healing and plants and folklore and all this, how much is core Jewish, or is just something that has been shared because of sharing the same environment? Because I think the local folklore in those forests is also very, very strong.
Yeah. Maybe I can add a comment in it maybe, because there is in the historical research, there is a discussion about this eruption or renaissance of Jewish people regarding their relations to the nature. And this renaissance of the beginning of the 20th century, the late 19th, beginning of the 20th century, is seen as part of a greater movement influenced by Romanticism.
Yeah.
And when also it's part of the process of modernity, when also groups of Christians around Europe are discovering the leisure activity of going into nature and also having walks and all the whole concept of walking as a leisure activity and rediscovering nature. It was completely a movement, and I think Jews found themselves also participating in this and taking their own twist on it, no?
Yeah,
Connecting
because
the tradition.
the sanatorium thing made me think about that as well.
Yeah.
And I'm going, just to finish, I'm going to be like a bit
Adelante.
I mean, I think you can go all the way to Nazism and find some connection with ecology somehow because of that.
Nazism has their own ecological point of view. Yeah.
Ecological point of view and a relationship to nature as well, but and it's probably rooted in the same movement initially.
In the romanticism.
And then they went their own way.
Yeah, but I think what Daniel is doing is putting a different kind of glasses, no?
Yeah.
I think is looking in a fresh way into this historical dynamics and trying to read it imaginatively and in a creative way. And you are actually you're not just creating the history, you are discovering it also.
Yeah. Okay.
I want to ask something. Lo haré en castellano nuevamente,
Vale.
porque todo el público es castellano parlante y el
Casi todo.
Okay.
Vale, claro, tu charla es sobre judaísmo y ecología y es entre las tradiciones y el activismo. Entonces, lo que quiero preguntarte es, ¿dónde tenemos que mirar hoy en día de lo que es el activismo diaspórico sobre este link entre tradición y activismo? Sobre todo pensando en el tema de los judíos, ya sea en el borde o no en el borde. Pero ¿qué es lo que está pasando ahora en Europa? ¿Quiénes se están activando? ¿Bajo qué paradigmas? ¿Bajo qué influencias, pensadores, etcétera? Eso es como qué tenemos hoy en día y hacia dónde debemos mirar.
Como los trenes, ¿no?
Un mapeo.
Un mapeo, sí. Aparte de ti, por supuesto, ma.
No. So thanks so much for that question. Is it better in English or in Spanish? English, right?
Yes, of course. English, yes.
Perfect.
So I actually think this is something we need to do together. We don't have many spaces where we really trace like a diaspora cartography of what's happening. And I do think what makes studying Jewish ecological activism difficult is that, from my experience in the ecological justice movement, I've been really blessed to work in many different spaces. There are tons of Jews working on ecological justice issues, most of them inspired by the radical social justice tradition of Judaism. And so a lot of those people are in spaces where they're putting themselves in service. But them being Jewish in that space isn't saying I'm a Jewish ecologist. They're practicing Jewish ethics of support for the other, of being in solidarity with other people. I would always notice, we would end up doing, celebrating Shabbat together, for example. But beyond that, not many folks, I think, say there's a real need for explicitly, unashamedly, publicly Jewish initiative for environmental justice. I think this is changing now. I think what's been happening in Palestine over the last years, the kind of state-based confiscation of Jewish memory and the use of a state to speak on behalf of the Jewish people, I think it's forcing a lot of people to kind of confront what does it mean to operate in this place where I'm Jewish, but I'm not really, I'm exercising my ethics in a maybe a more Moranist way, if I can say. But I think a work has to be done to map things diasporically. Part of Shlilat Hagalut and the denial of the diaspora is I don't think we have many good maps. And by maps, I don't just mean like an image. Deep understandings of all the amazing initiatives that are happening. There are incredible things happening in Argentina, in Brazil. We are not just a conversation between the US and Israel. We have, in any ways, the wealth that we have is that we have people all over the world. I know of fascinating work being done by German Jews in the island of Jerba off the coast of Tunisia now, by young people. So I don't have any, these are the top people to look at. I would encourage people to look at Miknaf Haaretz. Miknaf Haaretz is an initiative in the UK, which is encouraging folks to build a land-based Jewish approach to learning, to ritual, to belonging in the United Kingdom. But it is one where they don't just invite Jewish educators to teach. They invite educators from different backgrounds to talk about what it means to be a diaspora, a migrant diaspora in the UK. They've invited Sudanese activists to come and speak. It's a fascinating another example, and that's becoming incredibly popular. I think that we really have to, the Jewish organization with the highest membership in the world, if we're just understanding it by email membership, is Jewish Voice for Peace, right? That's probably the Jewish organization in the world with the highest amount of people signed up to their mailing list. How does that rebuild our cartography of who we think is important? I think things are changing very, very quickly. I don't have that incredible. I'm currently looking at Brazil and Argentina mainly, which interest me not because they're the biggest Jewish communities, but because, yeah, they're kind of off the beaten map. And you have very prominent Jewish activists in Brazil who have accomplished enormous things. I just think that the difficulty and the beauty, I think, of Jewish diasporic organizing is that when people really do the work, they don't ask for the credit. So some of the most amazing initiatives I know of in the climate movement have been set up by Jews. And when I know them privately, I know that their main orientation, their ethical compass is Jewish ecological thought. But they don't stand up, firstly, at these initiatives and take protagonism because they're often in service to other communities. So how do we almost visibilize the work of these people, but while honoring the way they move? Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah. Michael just asked in the chat if you can write the name of this initiative, and we will be able to.
Lo acabo de poner en el grupo de WhatsApp.
Muy bien.
Se me olvida sin Aret, ¿no?
Miknaf Aret.
Yeah. Well, it's the ecological ideas and the diasporical point of view. It's interesting connection. Another questions, comments?
I was reflecting a little bit closer to that as well.
Can you please talk louder or closer?
No, so the presentation, I was thinking kind of how much of that is really a Jewish topic, right? It's kind of the same thing, right? Like obviously it's all interrelated, and that's why across the cultures there are similar things popping up, and they have been popping up through the culture, through the times, right? But what kind of the common denominator really is kind of you start to think about the ecological stuff and the situations when kind of the community, I think, lives a little bit on a slower time, kind of not as hyper as we live in the current society, and you live closer to nature, right? As soon as you live closer to nature and you're dependent on it, you live through the seasons, you live how the things change across you, right? Like you kind of whichever religion or faith or absence of you have, right? So yeah, so that was kind of a bit of a reflection from my side.
Yeah,
it's all the same because it's for practical reasons. It is the same to an extent, right? Practical reasons because you're exposed to something and that generates certain movements within you. And I think one of the issues that we have is that we live mainly in the cities and we're not as exposed to it, right? And that's the reason why also in Latin America there was a whole lot more of it because you were a lot more exposed to nature. All of a sudden you were building cities to an extent, right? You were a lot more exposed to the land, to the environment.
Also in Ukraine of the beginning of the 20th century.
Exactly.
Which was a very natural, wild territory.
I mean, the whole
forests.
The whole industrial fuck up that we have happened over the last very few years, right? It's 60 to 80 years. If you go back 100 years, it was everywhere the same, right? So again, not depending on the religion, culture, or anything. Just people were closer to nature because people were living in nature, right? And they were dependent.
But there is the cultural aspect. I mean, if you are a Jew that live in a shtetl and you walk in the forest, you see the forest not only in the eyes of a person who lives on the edge of the city and in the forest, but also through your texts and your quotes. And when you see a beautiful flower, you can say a blessing. So it's part of the landscape. You have an internal cultural landscape.
That's the interaction between the internal and the external.
This is one of the points that creates a certain point of view, a cultural point of view on the reality. And this is another dimension that it's quite powerful.
True there, but is that really different in other cultures?
Other cultures has their own. They have their own landscape and
Exactly.
quotes and way to look at it, and you can see sometimes differences. Sometimes you see universality, and sometimes you see the tendency.
And I think Daniel pointed this out before. Like,
Yeah.
there's also some dynamics of the Städte itself. With
Yeah.
like, this legislation of like it has to be in focus for self-sustenance, not so much for industrial mass production.
Yeah.
So I think this changes also.
Completely, and also the social aspect that Jews couldn't have the possibility to own land or to work in a certain occupation, and it creates also a certain point of view.
Yeah.
I want to share also with you, Daniel. I was working on Chaim Nachman Bialik, which is the national poet of Israel, and he's from Ukrainian origin, and he was writing also about nature. And for him, in his biography, he inherit the position of a forest manager. And for him, it was very important to be also a successful forest manager, not only a poet, like to be a person who knows how to move in the world. He was completely a disaster, but and he failed. No, but it's represent the kind of occupations that people could what they can hold. No.
Well,
I didn't know. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
no, I was thinking about what you have exposed, that perhaps the Ashkenazi Jewish, especially from Russia, they are super kind of linked, especially to the forest. More to the land, because they do not own the land, they were no agriculture, but they do a lot of things in the forest. Like
And they in the shtetl they had the little huerto,
Yes.
and they had the goat, and they had some cows, and
But
Yeah.
talking about the main landscape, it
Yeah.
was the forest of Europe.
Forest is
The
powerful.
forest was even everybody knows about the Hasidic, that they have this special link to the forest
Yeah.
and the mushroom of the forest, and they took mushroom for to eat and also for to I don't know to get in ecstasies. Is a very linked culture in the forest. It's, I suppose, it's very different from the Sephardic Mizrahi culture about because the nature and the landscapes is different.
It was I was trying to comment is like your environment has a big impact on
How you think and how you live and
over the time, how you think and how you live and how you
Yeah.
relate to that. And it's very different to live in a forest than live in a city, than live on the
or
sea.
live in the
and-
north or live in the south, and every country north and the south.
Yeah, for example, the Baal Shem Tov was going for solitude in the Carpats, in the mountains and the forest there, and the Sephardic Jews didn't went through the process of this modernization, the modern interest in nature. They didn't went through this process. So their connection, which is a fascinating topic to dive into, their connection is connected more to more ancient practice, like Maimonides writing about nature, about herbs, about plants, what they can, like how they can be used for medicine and so on. So it's completely fascinating to see the Ashkenazi Sephardi approaches to it.
Even smaller communities like the Ethiopian Jews. This I know. I personally know nothing about how they relate to nature, and I'm sure there must be.
Yeah, no, sure they have, and it's interesting to see.
I would like to refer to well, there is a lot of information, Daniel. It's impossible for me to follow everything. But yes, please send us your presentation. But you said something you start with about what is defining ecology, the study of the connection in opposite of the separation. And for me, that makes a lot of sense. Because now we are placed nowadays we are in the mode separation. the people who is living wherever. I'm not talking about even the rural
Possibly even more.
population, or even South America. I have been there. I'm not talking the indigenous, most isolated, but the transversal world now is living this mode of separation. So this, for me, what Dima said about, yes, but we live in city. We are not about the nation, but we have plenty of signs about climate, for example, pollution, for example, the violence in the street, and because also ecology is about emotional, collective emotions and behaviors and all that. So
But the city is very different from the kind of like a countryside, right? Because city, we created ourselves. We feel we control it, although we don't, right? While when you are in a rural, like you are exposed to nature, you feel small, and you feel you understand that you cannot control it. Like there's a lot of things that are gonna completely changing when you are in a very protected, man-made building and man-made infrastructure that you try to control around you, and you can control to an extent, versus when you're exposed to kind of like all the winds and rains and everything else. Like, I don't know. I think there is a big mind shift difference what people experience in different places, but living in the city versus not living in the city.
But I would be agree, but that was before the iPhone,
not
before
separation.
TV, before, because the people in the rural scale, they are adopted as well for this technology. So most of our work connection to reality, it is even like virtual, even in those landscape. I don't know.
But also there is a discourse about
more and more.
There is a discourse about what is the ecology of the city and how it could be also encouraged because it's needed, like green rooftops and beehives within the city, and there are all sorts of
greenery.
There are attempts to address it.
I have several comments actually. The etymology of ecology is interesting because eco comes from house in Greek. So initially I understand it like the house is like a shelter, a separation from the elements. But we went like so far in that separation that now we need to a point that we need to realize that there is actually no separation, even if we try during all this time just to make a separation. And then I was thinking about also, I think it goes beyond the connection to nature. For me, it's more the connection to the local, and it goes beyond nature.
Yes.
The local culture, the local climate, the local everything.
Yes.
And even in a city, there is nature. It's just like you have to be able to open your eyes and to connect to it. It's everywhere. You just have to be in sync to detect it.
I think that.
But I think the local. I think it goes very much beyond, and it's a link to what I was saying before. Basically, it's also the local folklore, the local traditions, and I don't know if it was. I always think it's Claudia Roden when she was talking about food and what makes food Jewish. Maybe I'm wrong about like who say that, but what makes food Jewish is that you adopt it, adapt it, and then you carry it away with you when you leave. And there is something, I think there is something about that as well. Is that Jews is like to you arrive somewhere and you have to adopt and adapt, but then even if you're not living, we're not there yet, but you're carrying it inside you. You made it yours, and you made it Jewish as well. But it's still shared with others as well.
Yes.
Basically, we are well prepared as Jews for a catastrophe. Yeah, this is something.
And we have a lot of psychologists and psychoanalysts and all this.
And Daniele open with that ecology, the ecological and the social
Yes.
are the same thing. You know, they are entangled. And I completely agree. I think it's a very powerful, and the ecological struggle is also social struggle. But I think ecology is also a very strong metaphor for, like, the process you took us through. It's from the personal, you know, to many things. Even as if we talk about the instituto, as we move, we are actually, when we meet people, we say that we have an ecological approach. I mean, we try to identify who are our partners, who is active in our ecosystems, who could be our allies. No, so we use this metaphor in an organizational way because it's so powerful.
No, and communities and everything else, right? Like it's not just us and nature,
Yeah.
right?
No,
Like, we as nature is also animals, but in animals we also have our own communities, etc., etc. Yeah, I think there's also.
That's Daniel exposed it in a beautiful and very open and like a broad perspective about ecology, sport and nature.
Yeah. Sorry, Zev? I thought was that.
I wanted to ask if someone online has some comments or questions.
No comment, just a very interesting conversation and very interesting presentation too. I will have to look at it again in the video to research everything.
Thank you.
I put up a little comment, Zev, just
Please.
to make a
Please.
point. But I like
Vale.
very, very much the difference between that was mentioned by Daniel, between role model versus possibility model. I mean, I found this conceptual approach very, very enlightening. And it was, I don't know why, but it led me to the concept of metaphor. And Zev just mentioned metaphors as an element or a tool for projecting the activity. And nature and metaphor have lived together across many cultures. And I use the word metaphor instead of symbol, instead of more institutionalized elements of religion, culture, or that we may learn as members of institutions, etc. Because why do I say that? Well, in this country, at the end of the 20th century, like the last 40 years we saw that a sort of diasporization of the people working in the land, you know, whether they were owners of the land or they were just workers or, cultivating the land of others, as was my family, the economic transformations made many people go away from the land. And memories, unfortunately, many memories have been lost because generations are being lost. And the young people today try to recover them. But metaphor was, I just want to finish. Metaphor is the poetry of the poor people. And in my family, in my memories, in my personal memories, as a kid, when I looked at the conversations of my grandfather with the pastor or another person living distant from our house, etc., actually they were able to get together despite of the physical distance. I mean, and that's why I would question a little bit the concept of city versus land in terms of mental or cultural distance, because of the power that we have everywhere to link through visible, useful metaphors, right? And this creativity is something that it's, as you said, Daniel, a capital that is spread everywhere, a cultural capital, and also a possibilities capital, right? And I know this possibility concept is very much loaded with philosophical content, but it's still useful and and claiming an historical load of concept and development and the philosophical or political or imagination, etc., etc. So, thank you very much, Daniel. It was totally thrilled with the presentation. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. I'm happy to offer a few comments. I don't know if anyone has any other questions.
Perdona. Daniel, because super interesting what Valerie talked about the metaphor, but I also thinking about the narrative, the oral language, because I used to work most of my life with the rural population. Then I learned that they use another language, that is the oral language, and perhaps could be like you as a narrator, and also perhaps nowadays it could be now it has more value than ever. But I would like to hear about that, the narrative, oral translation, transmission, oral language, the language in okay. That's it.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think we have a lot of work to do to really reconstitute what we see as legitimate knowledge, and especially with ecological crises. I don't bring in indigenous peoples as a kind of to prolong this kind of noble savage narrative. Absolutely not. All communities are riven with problems. But if we're interested in protecting the world, we know that 80% of the world's biodiversity is protected in the lands which are protected by 15% of the world's population, which is considered indigenous. The highest levels of biodiversity in the world, the best really examples of ecological protection can be found in indigenous territory, where ecological knowledge is largely protected in oral storytelling. And the Jewish tradition is no stranger to orality. The Talmud itself was an oral archive until it was written down, right? So the written Torah and the oral Torah live together. I think we desperately need to listen much more to communities who are on the front lines of climate change, to indigenous communities, to peasant communities, to Afro-descendant communities. And many of those stories mean listening beyond people with fancy university titles, people with PhDs, people with all these accreditations, people who are expensively educated. And part of that means reorienting who we consider valuable of listening to. So I think orality is incredibly important. I would also remind us that, we spoke about this, like who's closer to nature or not. As far as I'm concerned, there's no separation, really. You cannot escape from a relationship with the world. You can be consciously distant and more consciously connected, but all of us eat, all of us drink, all of us breathe, all of us rely on the world all the time, whether you're in cities, whether you're in urban environments. And also, I think going back to the principle of banality of ecology, I think ecological visions are presented by everyone. You have ecologies being presented by hyper-racist organizations. The word ecology was pioneered by a German biologist, Eugen Heschel, who himself was a eugenicist, who I didn't think took the principles of his own idea seriously enough. He consistently ranked human beings in particular classifications. And I've today presented a very curated, selected group of ideas. We could have a whole session thinking about the ecological philosophy of the JNF, the Jewish National Fund. That's a particular environmental way of thinking about the world, one I think that is incredibly damaging, but one that is incredibly popular among many people who see planting trees, even if they're not native, even if they create a monoculture, simply as if the ecological crisis is an absence of trees, then planting trees is a good thing. They are competing ecological visions, and we need to kind of unpack them. What I find really interesting, going back to kind of, Zev was talking about this flourishing of thinking that comes from Romanticism, end of the 19th century, early 20th century. What I find interesting actually reading in a lot of the Zionist, anti-Zionist, non-Zionist debates is how prominent ecological metaphors, going back to metaphor, are. There's this constant idea of Jews are the right seed planted in the wrong place, and they have to be planted in the right place, and this being put forward all the time. If you read the works of Max Nordau, for example, Herzl's kind of right-hand man, you have constant attempts to talk about the Jewish body being one that's wrong, being one that's deformed and corrupted and has to be corrected by being in the right place. You even have this kind of militant idea of what they call corporal inversion, that the body has to be strengthened and taken away from this weak state into something else. So ideas of the body of ecology are just, they're everywhere. And I think what the topic that convenes us, to me, what diasporic ecologies could bring is one that says we need to build a world which isn't just for one group of people, which is for all of us to share, to cohabit. And cohabitation means being with difference. And that difference isn't just with human beings, it's with more than human beings. But I think that the first place to start is to remind ourselves that nature is a word that doesn't exist in many traditions. The idea of nature is incredibly absurd to many languages. The idea that there's something that isn't us, that isn't connected to us, there's us and nature. It can make sense in some ways, it doesn't make any sense in other ways. And the more that we learn about the human body, the more that we learn about ecologies. Coming back to where I started, right? Once we acknowledge that the majority of the human body is non-human cells, what does that even mean? You know, how do we relate to ourselves if we start to consider ourselves as composed of multitudes? But I would invite us just to remember that this is a practice of the synchronicity of scales. Often when we talk about the ecological crisis, you know, we could have a whole conversation on climate policy at a governmental level, at a state level, at an intergovernmental level. At the end of the day, we're only going to make it through this, which is a crisis which, if I trust the elders, if I trust the scientists, if I trust people who know the world a lot more than I do, we are heading, and we're already in very difficult times. What the prognosis is for what the outcomes of the violence that we've inflicted on the planet is really, really brutal. And I would remind people, in a way, the ecological crisis is a crisis of memory. Because of the way that the Earth system operates, it takes time for the impacts of actions to translate across the Earth system. The global warming that we're facing today is really the global warming of 50 years ago. It's only now translating into ripple effects across the atmosphere. It will take a lot of time for the impacts that we're doing right now to even translate in the next 50, 60 years. We're working with the violence of the past is very much with us. We're working with memory work all the time. But I think the invitation for all of us, kind of as Zeb was saying, how do we be more ecological in the ways we move? At every scale of our lives, you know, how do I see my relationship with someone else? As together we create an ecology. How is that ecology deserve to be treated? And that means departing away from individualism, where it's me against you. It's actually us. We're in an ecology together. And we can either choose to be right or we can choose to be in relationship. That's a different relationship than if we want to be just atoms. Ecology, I think, is a reminder of what we live in, the water we swim in. So I would just invite us, to kind of soften maybe our use of certain terms, like over there is nature and I'm not in nature, or I feel disconnected from nature. To be alive is to be connected and part of nature. As in one indigenous community's language in central Brazil, the only principle they have is shuku shuku, life always. The only thing that exists is life. There's no such thing as death. These ways of thinking, I think, which can be quite kind of hostile to some of the ways many of us have been brought up, I think can allow us to live a life that is a bit more interesting and alive, I think, as well, not just reparative for the world. I think that there's a lot of liberation and healing that can be found in the more than human world. Sorry for the spiel.
Thank you.
Okay.
Very good.
So, Daniel, thank you very much for opening this window or door for us. So we'll be in contact. I wish you a great stay where you are, successful,
Thank you so
fruitful
much.
one, and hope to see you back in Barcelona soon. Okay.
Thank you so
Thank you
much
very
for
much.
this honor. Blessings to you all. Thank you. Thank you for listening.